Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today we're going to be talking about this exchange, and in particular we're going to be talking about this position right here. So what you're looking at here is me doing what I think most people consider a back parry, or basically a low hanging parry that I put over my right shoulder. And the reason I bring this up is particularly because you see people do this sometimes, and a lot of people don't necessarily understand what the tactical relevance of this maneuver is. So if we break down the exchange, my opponent enters with a cut, I parry, I throw a left Zverk, which is parried, and then I throw my right Zverk. And it's at this point that I land a little bit on my opponent's arm, but I have a problem. And that is whenever you throw a right Zverk and you land on your opponent, and you're right-handed, as I am, you have to sort of turn a little bit more than maybe most people feel comfortable in order to make sure that your arms are above your head in such a way as you have a kind of, downward facing parry. So the idea here is that although you can't see it, my cross guard is horizontal and it's protecting me from downward strikes from above. The idea being that if my opponent had decided to, throw a looping, in his case, left Oberhau onto the top of my head while I threw my right Zverkow, I would land onto his arms, and then I'd have my parry sitting right up there in the way. The problem is that what happens a little bit more often than not is that your opponent realizes this, and rather than throwing a left Oberhau, they come all the way around, and they basically start trying to throw their own left Zverk or a left Mittelhau to what is now your back. And it's pretty much impossible to parry that, unless, of course, you put your sword behind you to the point where you can't see and basically just dangle it down your back, hoping that they threw a cut and that it's going to hit your sword and not hit your back. And there's obviously a lot of pros and cons to a position like this. The immediate pro, which you can see here, is that as I come back around from this position, I have no idea what my opponent is throwing, because as you can see here, I'm facing directly towards the camera. I can't see what my opponent is doing. I can't even really know that my parry worked until it hits my blade. And as I try to come back to a more neutral position, I just get hit right in the hands. Lucky for me, this particular format wouldn't have counted that after blow, and it was a tap to the hands anyway. But obviously the repercussions of doing this kind of back parry can be much more severe. But if we watch it one more time, the specific mechanics of this back parry happen right at the moment of contact, which I would say is right about here. So the idea is that, as I said before, when you land this Zverk, and you know that your opponent, because at least in this particular point, I can still see what my opponent is doing. You know that they're not going to throw a downward strike and they're coming around to the side. What you have to basically think of doing is that you're going to throw a hanging parry on your right side, but due to the fact that you're already turning, you overemphasize and you over accentuate that hanging parry to the point that you're just following the path of their sword to wherever it's going. And because it happens to be going to your back, that's where you end up. That, on top of the fact that after you throw this Zverk, it's often really difficult to stop the rotational momentum of your body to the point where you almost have to finish this little bit of a rotation. You can see what my leg is doing here, where as my foot hits the ground to throw this Zverk out, you see it skip off the floor once or twice. That's the fact that I have basically enough hip rotation and momentum that as I manage to get my hands over my head into this position here, where I'm about to land my Zverk, I can't stop in time. And as I know that, one, I'm going to rotate maybe a little bit more than I should, and two, that my opponent is going to now strike me in the back, this is really the only thing that I can do to keep myself safe from that afterblow. So with this, we're going to see a different example of this exact same concept. Only this time, there's a little bit of a follow-through and an overrun going on. And if you watched one of my previous videos, I talk about this situation as well, which is that oftentimes when somebody is constantly exiting an exchange that you're having, so in this particular case, my opponent basically threatens with a thrust, I go for the stepping parry, I don't actually hit anything, I basically hold my follow-up in the air in an attempt to get my opponent to throw up the wrong parry. I then throw my follow-up low. My opponent parries it anyway. And right here, while I'm sitting up here in my right ox, my momentum is such that I have to finish this step with my left leg. I have to basically take this step forward. But at the same time as it's happening, my opponent has made the decision to take a step over to their left side out of the engagement with their left leg. So as we both can't really change what we're about to do, as his leg lands, he throws his cut towards my back, and as I can't really do anything about my left leg, I do the only thing I can do, which is basically going from a similar situation I was in the last exchange, where in order to block this incoming threat, I have to throw up a hanging parry, but because I'm forced to go in this leftward direction, I have to then just put the sword behind my own back and hope that that's where my opponent is going to hit me. And you can know that that's where they're going to hit them, because at the end of the day, this person is going 45-degree angle backwards from my side, which means I can't even really drape the sword over my right shoulder and effectively know that I'm going to parry my back, which is, inevitably where this cut that you see coming in is going to land. Now, in this particular case, my opponent, thanks to their backward motion, only manages to just nick my sword a little bit. But the other thing that's worth pointing out here is immediately after, you see the same recovery that you saw in the last example. I have to go from putting my hands back over my own head and basically being unable to see what's going on to turning, pivoting, and pulling my hands back into a more defensive area. And you'll see that my opponent had a similar situation. If you watch my opponent's left foot here, right as they take this step back to throw their cut, they pivot and compass step on their left foot. Then they start moving their right foot to basically turn their angle to where I'm going to be. And by the time all of that happens, we're both standing here in neutral, just right in front of each other, with nothing really having had been done. And then after that, which we'll watch the whole thing one more time, we have another situation. And this is really the third example where you're going to see this back parry happen, which is I go for a basic left plow, onsets and stab right to my opponent's chest. My opponent pushes up and to the side over to his top left quadrant. And as a result, I am once again stuck in my momentum. They have done the same lunge, backwards lunge toward their left foot, caddy corner to where I'm coming from, which means that after I parry this blow here, you know that there's going to be another left zverk coming. And the only thing I can do, having parried here, is to try to get my sword over into this area as quickly as possible. And in this particular case, you do that by dipping your point as low as you possibly can, go into that hanging parry, and then after the contact is made, again, because I'm forced to continue my momentum forward, I end up in this similar sort of back parry position. But what this example really shows you is what this situation looks like under normal circumstances and why you end up in those extremely bizarre looking circumstances afterwards. So if we go back all the way to the first example and we see what happens here when I'm putting this behind my head, the reason that this ends up happening is because I was trying to throw up a hanging parry here that I knew wasn't going to protect me, so I had to overemphasize the angle. Whereas in the later example, I can throw a more normal hanging parry and know that my opponent isn't going to be able to get into my back area. But because of the forward momentum that I can't quite stop, I end up in that exact same position. So if you continue this logical thread and you want to talk about when it is and isn't okay to throw this technique, what you have to contend with is the fact that this is a desperation move more than anything. And it's particularly only useful for parrying an afterblow if you've already made meaningful contact. If all you're doing is protecting yourself while putting your sword in this position, chances are what's going to happen to you is exactly what happens here, which is after my opponent manages to hit my back parry, they simply come back around and hit me in the front. And there's really no reason that you shouldn't have that done to you anytime you throw one of these back parries. So the only time you can reasonably get away with it is if coming out of a right zverk or a right Oberhau that you have already made meaningful contact. And in this particular example, you can see that I did not do that. If this was a zverk, it would have been extremely flat, so you wouldn't have really wanted to call that quality. And as a result, after I make that parry, sure, I've managed to defend myself, but I'm still not able to defend myself afterwards, and my opponent appropriately punishes me. All right, that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send an email over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.